It was late October, and the rain had been coming down all day. A steady, unrelenting downpour that turned the dirt roads to mud and filled the air with the thick scent of wet earth and rotting leaves. I had been driving for hours, my hands gripping the steering wheel, my headlights cutting through the dark, misty evening as I made my way deeper into the woods. The wipers worked hard against the rain, but it felt like they were barely making a difference. The road ahead twisted and turned, the trees leaning over like silent sentinels, their branches swaying under the weight of the storm. I hadn't planned on being out this late. The visit to town had taken longer than expected, and now I was stuck in the middle of nowhere, driving toward a place I had been avoiding for months. My husband's cabin. I used to love this drive. We used to make it together, the truck packed with supplies, a cooler filled with food, and our dog curled up in the back seat. But that was before everything changed, before the accident, before I was left alone. The rain picked up, hammering against the windshield. The road was barely visible now, just a slick ribbon of mud and gravel cutting through the thick forest. The tires skidded slightly, and I eased off the gas, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't need to get stuck out here. There was no cell service, no way to call for help. Just me and the storm. After what felt like an eternity, I saw the turnoff. The old wooden sign was barely visible in the dark, half covered in moss, the letters worn down by years of rain and wind. The driveway was just a narrow, overgrown path leading deeper into the trees. I took a deep breath and turned in, my tires crunching over wet leaves and twigs. The cabin was exactly as I had left it. The front porch sagged slightly, the windows dark, the wooden walls damp from the rain. It looked abandoned, forgotten, but it wasn't. It was still mine, ours. I killed the engine and sat there for a moment, listening to the rain drumming against the roof. My breath fogged up the glass. I didn't want to go inside. I didn't want to face the memories that waited for me in there, but I had nowhere else to go. I grabbed my bag and stepped out, my boots sinking into the mud. The cold hit me instantly, the wind cutting through my jacket as I made my way up the porch steps. The key was still under the loose plank, just where we had always kept it. My fingers were numb as I fit it into the lock, twisting it until the door creaked open. Inside, it was dark and musty. The air was thick with the scent of damp wood and old ashes. I fumbled for the flashlight in my bag and clicked it on, the beam cutting through the shadows. Everything was exactly the same. The old armchair in the corner, the kitchen table covered in dust, the bookshelf lined with worn paperbacks. His jacket still hung on the hook by the door. I swallowed hard and forced myself to move. I needed to get a fire going. The woodpile by the fireplace was still stocked, though the logs were damp. I stacked them carefully, striking a match and holding it to the kindling. The flames hesitated, flickering weakly before finally catching. The glow of the fire made the cabin feel smaller, more intimate. The rain outside was relentless, pounding against the roof, the wind howling through the trees. I tried to shake the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. It was just the storm, just the emptiness of the place. I made myself a cup of tea, my hands trembling slightly as I held it close to my chest. I hadn't eaten all day, but my stomach was tight with nerves. I sat on the old couch, staring into the fire, trying not to think about the last time we had been here together. Then I heard it, a noise outside. It was faint, barely audible over the rain. A rustling sound, like footsteps moving through the wet leaves. My pulse spiked. I set the mug down slowly, straining to hear. Another sound, closer this time, a soft thud, like someone stepping onto the porch. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. I wasn't supposed to be here alone. No one knew I had come. The wind howled again, rattling the windows. Maybe it was just a branch falling. Maybe the storm was playing tricks on me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I stood slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs. The flashlight was still on the table. I grabbed it and moved toward the door, my footsteps silent against the wooden floor. I hesitated, then flicked the light on and shone it through the window. Nothing, just rain and darkness. The trees swayed violently, their branches whipping back and forth. The mud was slick and glistening under the beam of my flashlight. I exhaled shakily, trying to calm my nerves. I was being paranoid. The storm was loud. The night was unfamiliar without him here. That was all. I turned away from the window and froze. A single, wet footprint was on the floor just inside the door. My stomach twisted. I hadn't tracked in any mud. I had wiped my boots on the porch mat. I slowly turned back toward the door, my blood pounding in my ears. The lock. Had I locked it behind me? Couldn't remember. The fire crackled softly behind me. The rain a constant roar outside. The cabin felt smaller now, suffocating. I reached for the handle, hesitated, then threw the deadbolt into place. Something was out there, or someone. I backed away from the door, my hands clenched into fists. My mind raced. I had no weapon, no way to defend myself. The only phone was useless out here. Then, another sound. Not outside this time. Inside. I whipped around, the flashlight beam trembling as I swept it across the room. Nothing. The chair in the corner. The bookshelf. The open doorway leading to the bedroom. I was alone, wasn't I? I took a step forward, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. Then I saw it. The bedroom door. It had been open when I came in. Now it was closed. A fresh set of muddy footprints led right to it. My vision blurred for a second as fear surged through me, sharp and blinding. I wasn't alone. I had never been alone. The rain pounded against the roof. The fire hissed and crackled. I could hear my own heartbeat, fast and ragged in my chest. I had two choices, run or fight. I took a deep breath and reached for the heaviest thing I could find, a rusted fireplace poker. My fingers wrapped around the cold metal as I took a step forward. The floor creaked. The door handle turned. For a moment, time froze. Then, in a blur of motion, the door burst open. I swung without thinking, the poker connecting with something solid. A grunt, a sharp intake of breath. Then footsteps. Fast, stumbling footsteps, retreating. I lunged forward, swinging again, but I hit only air. The back door slammed open, and I barely caught a glimpse of a dark figure disappearing into the rain. I stood there, gasping, shaking, my grip white-knuckled around the poker. The cabin was silent again. Just the fire, just the rain. But I knew the truth now. Someone had been here, watching, waiting. I locked every door, shoved furniture against them, and sat with my back to the wall, staring at the flames until the sun came up. I never saw their face, never found out who they were or what they wanted. But I never went back to that cabin again. It happened in the middle of nowhere, the kind of place where cell service was just a rumor and the nearest town was a good hour's drive on roads that looked like they hadn't been paved in a decade. The cabin wasn't mine, wasn't even really supposed to be there. It was one of those abandoned places people forget about, the kind that should have been torn down but somehow stayed standing. I was there because I needed to be, not for some thrill, not because I had some weird fascination with being out in the woods alone. I just needed space, a break from everything. Too much had been happening back in town, too much pressure, too many eyes watching. I needed somewhere no one would bother me. I had found the cabin years ago while hiking, just a passing memory at the time. But when I needed to get away, it was the first place that came to mind. So I packed a bag, filled up the truck, and drove until I was surrounded by nothing but trees and silence. The first night was uneventful. Just me, the quiet, and the wind moving through the trees. The cabin was in bad shape, wood rotting in places, windows cracked or missing altogether, the door hanging on by barely anything. But it was good enough for what I needed. I set up in the one corner where the roof didn't seem like it was about to cave in, rolled out my sleeping bag, set my knife within reach, and let the weight of exhaustion pull me down. The second night is when I noticed something was off. It wasn't the kind of fear that hits you all at once. It was slow, creeping, the feeling of being watched, of something being just out of sight. I tried to ignore it, blame it on being alone in an unfamiliar place. But then I heard it, footsteps outside. Not an animal, Too heavy, too deliberate. Someone was out there. I reached for my knife and waited. The footsteps stopped just outside the cabin. The air felt thick, like something was pressing down on me. I strained to listen, barely breathing. The door creaked, shifting slightly, but it didn't open. Whoever was out there wasn't in a hurry. They wanted me to know they were there. Minutes passed. Then the footsteps moved away, slow and steady, disappearing into the woods. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping the knife so hard my hand ached. Morning came, but the unease didn't fade. I stepped outside, scanning the tree line. Nothing. No tracks, no sign that anyone had been there. But I knew what I heard. I thought about leaving, packing up and getting out before whatever this was turned into something worse. But I had come out here to escape, and the idea of going back to everything I was trying to avoid didn't sit right with me. I convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe just some hunter passing through, maybe my own paranoia getting the best of me. But by nightfall, I wasn't so sure. The air felt different, heavier, like the whole forest was waiting for something. I kept the knife closer this time, my body tense, my ears straining for any sound. And then it came again. The footsteps, slow, deliberate, closer this time. I stayed completely still, barely daring to breathe. The door creaked again, a little more this time, as if someone was testing it. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then silence, the kind of silence that's worse than noise, because it meant whoever was out there wasn't leaving this time. I gripped the knife tighter, my mind racing. If they came in, I'd have no choice. Then, suddenly, the door slammed open. A flashlight blinded me, and before I could move, a heavy boot landed on my chest, pinning me down. A knee pressed into my ribs, and cold metal touched my throat. A voice finally spoke, rough and steady. "Don't move." I didn't. The flashlight moved away just enough for me to see his face. A cop, older, maybe mid-40s, clean-shaven, uniform wrinkled but intact. No badge number visible. He didn't look surprised to see me. He looked like he had expected it, like he had been waiting. For a long moment, he just stared at me, like he was deciding something. Then he stepped back, letting me breathe. "Get up," he said. I did, keeping my knife low but ready. The cop glanced around the cabin, taking in the state of it, then looked back at me. His expression didn't change. "You alone?" I nodded. He seemed to consider that, then turned toward the door. "Come with me." Something about the way he said it made my stomach twist. I didn't move. "Why?" He looked back, eyes cold. "Because I said so." I knew then that I wasn't walking out of those woods if I went with him. I don't know what tipped me off. Maybe the way he was too calm, too sure of himself. Maybe the fact that he had shown up without a car, without backup, without even announcing himself properly. Maybe it was just instinct. But I knew this wasn't a normal cop. I took a step back. He sighed. "Don't make this harder." Then he reached for something at his side. I didn't wait. I lunged, knife flashing, and for a second, I thought I had the upper hand. The blade met resistance, slicing into fabric and skin, but then pain exploded in my ribs. I stumbled back, breath hitching. He had hit me hard, but not with his gun. His fist. I forced myself to move, swinging again. This time, he caught my wrist, twisting it so hard I thought the bone would snap. My knife hit the floor. Then he hit me again, and everything went black. I woke up to the smell of dirt and blood. My head throbbed, my body ached, and when I tried to move, I realized my hands were tied. The cop stood over me, wiping his knife clean. "My knife." He crouched down, tilting his head. "You shouldn't have done that." I didn't answer. He sighed, like he was tired of me already. "It didn't have to be this way." Then he stood up, reaching for something behind him. A shovel. Panic surged through me. I struggled, the rough rope cutting into my wrists. He watched me for a second, then started digging. I knew what was coming. I don't know how long I fought. Long enough for the skin on my wrists to tear, for blood to soak into the dirt. Long enough for the hole to get deeper. Then, just as he turned back to me, shovel still in hand, I felt the rope give. I moved before he could react. I don't remember much of what happened next, just flashes, the weight of the shovel in my hands, the sound it made when it connected, the way his body hit the ground, twitching, and then nothing. I stood there for a long time, breathing hard, staring down at him. Then I dropped the shovel and ran. Took me hours to find my way back to my truck. I drove without stopping, without looking back. By the time I reached town, my hands were still shaking. I never reported it, never told anyone what happened, because I knew no one would believe me, and because I knew, somewhere out there, someone else like him was still waiting. I was never the type of person to believe that the world was a completely safe place. I knew bad things happened to good people, that some places were better left alone, and that no matter how careful you were, danger could find you. But I never expected to find myself at the center of something truly terrifying. It started with a simple trip, a getaway to a rented cabin deep in the woods of Montana. I was 34 at the time, working a construction job in Billings. Life had been a constant cycle of early mornings, long hours, and exhaustion. The idea of spending a week alone in a cabin sounded perfect. No noise, no stress, just the peace and quiet of nature. The cabin belonged to an old friend, Rick, who had inherited it from his uncle. He barely used it, so when I mentioned wanting to get away for a while, he offered it to me for free. I didn't think twice about saying yes. I packed light, a couple of changes of clothes, some canned food, a rifle just in case of bears, and enough beer to last me the week. I left early in the morning, driving for nearly 6 hours into the valley where the cabin sat, surrounded by thick trees and rolling hills. By the time I got there, the sun was starting to set. The cabin was simple, just like Rick had described. A single-story structure with a slanted metal roof, faded wooden walls, and a small front porch. It had a fireplace, an old generator for electricity, and enough supplies to last a month if needed. It was exactly what I wanted: quiet, isolated, and peaceful. The first couple of days were uneventful. I spent my time hiking, chopping wood, and sitting by the fire with a drink in my hand. The woods were alive with the sounds of nature. Birds in the morning, crickets at night, the occasional rustling of deer moving through the underbrush. But by the third night, something felt off. It was around midnight when I woke up suddenly, my body tense for no reason. The cabin was silent, the fire nothing but glowing embers. I sat up, listening. The wind had picked up, making the trees creak outside. At first, I thought that was what had woken me up, but then I heard something else. Footsteps. Not the light, cautious steps of an animal, but the deliberate movement of someone walking. Slow, careful. I held my breath. The sound was coming from just outside the cabin, near the porch. I reached for my rifle, keeping my movements quiet. My mind raced. I hadn't seen another person since I arrived. There were no trails leading to the cabin, no reason for anyone to be out here. I stayed still, listening. The footsteps stopped. I waited, every muscle in my body tight. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I heard them again. This time moving away from the cabin, disappearing into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. I kept the rifle close, my ears trained on every little sound. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a hiker who had gotten lost, maybe an animal that just sounded human. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I found footprints in the dirt near the porch. Boot prints. Someone had been there. I scanned the trees, looking for any sign of movement, but the forest was still. My gut told me to pack up and leave, but a part of me didn't want to. I had come out here to be alone, to get away from the stress of life. The last thing I wanted was to cut my trip short because of something that could have been harmless. So I stayed. That night, I locked the door, shut the curtains, and kept my rifle within arm's reach. The fire crackled softly, the only light in the dark cabin. I forced myself to relax, convincing myself that whoever had been out there was long gone. Then, around 2 a.m., I heard it again. The same slow, deliberate footsteps. I gripped my rifle, my heart hammering in my chest. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. Silence. I held my breath, waiting. Then the doorknob turned. It didn't rattle, didn't jerk violently, just a slow, careful turn, like someone testing it. I pointed the rifle at the door, my finger on the trigger. If it opened, I would fire. No hesitation. But it didn't open. After a long moment, the knob turned back, and the footsteps moved away again, disappearing into the woods. I didn't sleep. At sunrise, I checked outside. The footprints were fresh, circling the cabin. Whoever it was had been watching me. That was it. I wasn't staying another night. I packed my things fast, throwing everything into my truck. The whole time, I felt like I was being watched. The trees seemed darker, the air heavier. When I turned the key, the engine sputtered but didn't start. My blood went cold. I tried again. Nothing. I popped the hood and checked the engine, but I wasn't a mechanic. The truck had been fine when I drove in. There was no reason for it to suddenly stop working, unless someone had done something to it. A feeling of pure dread washed over me. I was stranded. I grabbed my rifle and took off on foot. The nearest town was over 20 miles away, but I wasn't staying here another second. I moved fast, my heart pounding. The woods felt different, wrong. Every little sound made my skin crawl. I kept checking behind me, half expecting to see someone following. An hour passed, then two. Then I saw the cabin. I stopped dead in my tracks. I had been walking in a straight line, following the sun, but somehow I had ended up right back where I started. Panic set in. I wasn't stupid, I knew how to navigate. I had been careful. This wasn't a mistake. Someone had led me back. I backed away from the cabin, gripping my rifle. The woods were too quiet. Then, from the corner of my eye, I saw movement. A figure, standing between the trees, watching me. I didn't think, I just ran. Branches whipped against my face. My lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I ran until my legs gave out, collapsing onto the dirt. For a long time, I just lay there, gasping for air, waiting for something to grab me. But nothing did. When I finally looked up, I realized I was on a road. A road. I had no idea how I got there, but I didn't care. An old truck was coming down the road, its headlights cutting through the early morning mist. I stumbled toward it, waving my arms. The driver, an old man, pulled over. He didn't ask any questions, just took one look at me and told me to get in. I didn't look back. I never went back for my truck. Never told Rick what happened. Some places aren't meant to be visited, and some people, whoever they are, don't want you to leave. I had taken a job watching over a remote hunting cabin deep in the Montana wilderness for the winter. It wasn't my first time doing something like this, but it was the longest stretch I had ever committed to. 5 months alone in the mountains, miles from the nearest town. The cabin belonged to a man named Everett, a retired doctor from California who only came up here during hunting season. He needed someone to keep an eye on the place through the winter, clear the snow off the roof, and make sure no squatters moved in. In exchange, he was paying me a decent amount, plus I had free use of the cabin. I didn't mind the isolation. I was used to being alone, and I liked the idea of having time away from everything. I had a satellite phone in case of emergencies, a generator, and enough supplies to last the entire winter. Everett had left in late November after hunting season ended, and I had settled into a quiet routine. The cabin itself was sturdy and well-built, with thick log walls and a stone chimney that held heat well. It sat near the edge of a clearing, surrounded by thick pines. The only way in was a winding dirt road that became impassable once the heavy snow came in, which meant that once I was up there for the winter, I was stuck until the thaw. Inside, there was a main living area with a wood stove, a small kitchen, a bedroom with a bunk bed, and a storage room where Everett kept extra supplies. The windows had heavy wooden shutters, which I kept closed at night. The first month passed without incident. The snow came down heavy by early December, making the road completely impassable. I kept myself busy by chopping firewood, reading, and hiking around the cabin when the weather allowed. I had my rifle with me, mainly for protection against wildlife. There were wolves in the area, and Everett had warned me about mountain lions. It wasn't until mid-January that things started to feel off. I first noticed it when I woke up one morning and saw fresh footprints in the snow leading up to the cabin. They weren't mine. They circled the entire cabin, stopping at each window, then trailed off into the trees. At first, I thought maybe a hunter had gotten lost and wandered through, but that didn't make sense. The road was buried under feet of snow, and there were no tire tracks, no sign of anyone arriving on a snowmobile. I went outside, rifle in hand, and followed the tracks a few hundred feet into the woods before they just stopped. There was no sign of anyone turning around. The footprints simply ended, as if whoever made them had vanished into thin air. I spent the rest of the day on edge, checking the windows constantly. That night, I locked the doors and kept the rifle within arm's reach. Over the next week, strange things kept happening. One morning, I found the wooden shutters on one of the windows open, even though I was sure I had closed them the night before. Another time, I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of crunching snow outside. I sat up, heart pounding, listening. The sound circled the cabin, then stopped. I waited for what felt like an eternity before grabbing my flashlight and slowly peeking out the window. There was nothing. The snow was undisturbed. I barely slept that night. One morning in late January, I stepped outside to grab more firewood and noticed something that made my stomach drop. The latch on the cabin door was on the outside. It was one of those simple metal latches, the kind you could slide open from either side. But I always latched it from the inside before bed. That morning, it was latched from the outside. Someone had locked me in. The realization sent a cold shiver through me. I checked the cabin from top to bottom, but nothing was missing. Nothing was out of place. The shutters were closed. The footprints outside had been covered by fresh snow. By early February, I was sleeping less and less. Every night, I heard noises outside, footsteps in the snow, the sound of something moving just beyond the treeline. I stopped going outside after dark. Then, on February 8th, it all came to a head. That night, I woke to a faint scraping sound at the cabin door. It was slow, deliberate. I grabbed my rifle and crept toward the door, listening. The scraping continued, then stopped. A moment later, something heavy pressed against the door. The wood creaked under the weight. I raised the rifle, my hands shaking. Then silence. I stood there, frozen, listening. The air was so still I could hear my own heartbeat. Then I heard it, a faint, whisper-like sound right against the door. I couldn't make out words, just the low murmur of something breathing. Then, footsteps. They moved away from the door, slow and deliberate, crunching the snow as they circled the cabin. Then bang, something slammed against the back wall. I spun around, heart hammering, pointing the rifle toward the back of the cabin. Then, another bang, this time from the front. I backed toward the center of the room, gripping the rifle so hard my fingers ached. The banging came again, louder, as if someone was testing the strength of the walls. I stood there for hours, waiting. Then, just before dawn, the noise stopped. I didn't sleep. I didn't even move from that spot. When the first light of morning crept through the gaps in the shutters, I finally found the courage to step outside. The snow was disturbed in a wide circle around the cabin. Tracks, dozens of them, crisscrossed the clearing. Some led up to the windows, others to the door. A few stopped suddenly, just like the ones I had seen weeks ago. And then, I saw something that made my stomach churn. A set of prints, larger than the others, leading from the back of the cabin to the treeline. And at the very edge of the forest, just before the tracks disappeared into the trees, was something half buried in the snow. A wooden latch, the same kind that was on my door. I packed my things that morning, grabbed my rifle, and started hiking down the snow-covered road. It took me 2 days to reach the nearest town. When I finally got there, I called Everett and told him I was done. I never went back to that cabin. I never even asked what might have been out there. I wasn't supposed to be there that long. It was a work trip, just a simple job. My boss needed someone to check on a property he was thinking of buying. Some old hunting cabin deep in the French countryside. A place he figured he could renovate and flip for a good profit. He was too busy to go himself, and I was the only one on the team who spoke enough French to get by. I landed in Paris on a cold, wet morning, rented a car, and drove south for hours. The landscape changed from the sprawling city to rolling green fields, then to thick, dark forests. My GPS lost service by the time I got close to the cabin, and I had to rely on a printed map my boss gave me. The roads turned into dirt paths, then narrowed even further, winding through dense trees. By the time I reached the cabin, it was late afternoon. The sky was gray, the air damp. The place looked worse than I expected. The logs were weathered and dark, the roof sagging in places. The front door was slightly warped, and the windows were so dirty that I couldn't see inside. I parked my car near the tree line, grabbed my bag, and stepped out. The silence hit me immediately. No cars, no voices, not even the sound of birds. Just the wind rustling through the trees. The key was in a small lockbox near the door. My boss had gotten it from the previous owner, an old man who no longer had the energy to maintain the place. He had given up on selling it years ago, but agreed to let my boss have a look. I stepped inside. The air was thick with dust and old wood. A single room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen, and a narrow staircase leading to a loft. The furniture was sparse. Just a table, a few chairs, and a sagging couch near the fireplace. The whole place smelled damp, like it hadn't been lived in for years. I walked through the cabin, checking for any obvious issues. The roof needed work. The walls had signs of water damage. The floor creaked under my weight. Upstairs, the loft held a single bed with a thin mattress and a wooden dresser against the wall. The window up there gave a view of the dense forest stretching for miles. I decided to stay the night. It was a long drive back to town, and I was tired. Besides, I wanted to get a real sense of the place before reporting back to my boss. I set up my sleeping bag on the couch and lit the fireplace. The warmth helped, but the silence still felt unnatural. I stepped outside to get some fresh air. The woods were thick, the trees tall and pressed close together. The undergrowth was dense, and the ground was soft from recent rain. My footprints sunk slightly into the mud. As I stood there, I had the sudden, uncomfortable feeling that I wasn't alone. I turned quickly, scanning the trees. Nothing, just darkness between the trunks. The wind had picked up, making the branches sway. I went back inside, locking the door behind me. I told myself it was just the unfamiliarity of the place messing with me. I wasn't used to this kind of isolation. I checked my phone. No signal, not even a single bar. The fire crackled as I sat on the couch, going over my notes. I tried to ignore the uneasy feeling in my stomach. A soft sound came from outside. I froze. It was faint but distinct. Footsteps on wet leaves. I turned off my flashlight and sat completely still, listening. The sound came again. Slow, deliberate steps just beyond the cabin walls. I reached for my bag and pulled out the small knife I always carried. Not much, but better than nothing. The footsteps stopped. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy. I waited, my heart pounding. Minutes passed, maybe longer. Finally, I convinced myself that I had imagined it. Maybe an animal had wandered close. I forced myself to relax and eventually drifted into a restless sleep. I woke up suddenly. The fire had burned low, casting long shadows across the room. And the door was open. Not wide open, but just enough that a sliver of darkness crept inside. I knew I had locked it. I sat up slowly, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. I listened. Nothing. The woods outside were still. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it toward the door. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the trees beyond. Something moved, a shape just at the edge of the light, tall, motionless, watching. I jerked the flashlight upward, but it was gone. I slammed the door shut and locked it again. I barely slept after that. Every small creak of the cabin made my skin crawl. By morning, I was ready to leave. I packed my things quickly and stepped outside. The The air was cold, the sky heavy with clouds. I checked around the cabin. That's when I saw them. Footprints, leading from the treeline to the cabin, stopping just outside the door. No tracks leading away. Whoever or whatever had been there never walked back into the woods. I didn't bother investigating further. I got in my car and drove away, gripping the wheel tight. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. I called my boss from a cafe, told him the place was a lost cause. The repairs would be too expensive, the location too remote. He didn't argue. I didn't mention what had happened. A week later, he called to tell me the old owner had passed away. The cabin was abandoned now. No one was going to buy it. No one was going to live there again. And that was for the best. I had never liked the idea of isolation. Some people dream of it, the quiet, the stillness, the separation from the world. But to me, it always felt wrong. I liked knowing I could walk down a street and pass a stranger, that I could hear the hum of a distant highway or the voices of neighbors arguing through a thin apartment wall. That noise meant life. But sometimes, life doesn't let you choose. The cabin had belonged to my uncle. I wasn't close to him, but when he passed, I somehow ended up being the one stuck with the place. It was deep in the woods, somewhere in northern Michigan, about a 40-minute drive from the nearest town. My uncle had lived out there alone for most of his life, only coming into town for supplies or to grab a drink at one of the few bars. People knew him, but nobody really knew him. I had no plans to keep the cabin, but selling it meant I had to go there, clean it up, take stock of what was inside, and make sure everything was in order. I had taken time off work, packed enough supplies to last a couple of nights, and drove up alone. It was late afternoon when I arrived, and the moment I stepped out of my truck, I felt it, that suffocating quiet. No birds, no wind through the trees, just stillness. The cabin was old, worn down by years of rough winters and neglect. The roof sagged in places, and the wooden porch creaked under my boots. The front door was unlocked, which didn't surprise me. I doubted my uncle ever bothered locking it, given how far out he lived. Inside, it smelled of dust, old wood, and something faintly metallic. The furniture was sparse. A small kitchen table, a single couch, an armchair, and a bed in the corner. There were no signs of any personal life. No pictures, no books, just a hunting rifle mounted on the wall and a few basic supplies. The first night was quiet. I had brought my own blankets, not wanting to sleep on whatever had been left on the old bed. I had a flashlight, but I mostly relied on the old oil lamps that still had fuel in them. The light flickered against the walls, making the shadows shift. I ate a quick meal from a can, locked the door out of habit, and laid down. Sleep didn't come easy. I kept waking up to small noises, not loud ones, just the kind of sounds you think you hear but aren't sure about. The creak of a floorboard, a rustle outside, a faint tap against the wall. I told myself it was just the woods settling, just animals, just my own paranoia. By morning, nothing had happened. No signs of anything strange. I felt a little foolish for how uneasy I had been, but I shook it off and got to work. I spent most of the day clearing out old junk. My uncle hadn't left much behind, but there were a few things I had to sort through. Rusty tools, a few old hunting knives, a couple of boxes of clothes that smelled like mildew. In one of the drawers, I found a notebook. It was small, leather-bound, with my uncle's name scratched into the cover. The first few pages were normal, just notes about hunting, repairs he needed to make to the cabin, little reminders to himself. But as I flipped further, the entries became different. Asterisk saw him again today, watching from the trees. Thought I lost him last winter, but he's still out there. Asterisk. Asterisk, he gets closer at night. Heard him at the door. Won't open it. Won't let him in. Asterisk. Asterisk tracks in the snow. Bare feet. Not human. Asterisk. I shut the notebook and set it aside. I wasn't in the mood for weird ramblings. That night, the noises were louder. Something moved outside. I could hear the crunch of leaves, the snap of a twig. I held my breath, listening, waiting, Then 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the door. I didn't move. The knocks came again. I reached for the rifle on the wall, but my hands were shaking. I had no idea if it was even loaded, and I wasn't going to fumble around in the dark to find out. I stayed frozen, gripping the gun, staring at the door. The knocking stopped. Minutes passed, maybe hours. I didn't sleep. I just sat there waiting for the sun. By morning, I finally forced myself to step outside. The ground was damp from the night air, but something caught my eye near the porch. Bare footprints, too large to be human, too long. I packed my things. I didn't bother cleaning up, didn't try to take anything else with me. I just grabbed my bag, locked the cabin, and got into my truck. The whole drive back to town, I kept checking the rearview mirror. I never went back. A few weeks later, I put the cabin up for sale. No one was interested. Eventually, I just gave up and let it rot. But sometimes, at night, I think about those footprints, and I wonder if my uncle was ever really alone out there. I never liked spending too much time in the woods. Some people find it peaceful. Something about the quiet, the stillness, the way you can hear yourself think. But I always found it unsettling. Too much space, too much isolation, too much time to notice things you shouldn't. I took the job out of necessity, not choice. I was between work, low on money, and a friend of a friend knew a guy who needed someone to watch over a remote hunting cabin for the season. The owner was an old man named Don, and he wasn't the kind of guy who took no for an answer. "It's easy work," he'd said. "Just stay in the cabin, keep an eye on things, make sure no squatters or animals mess up the place." I should have asked more questions. The cabin was deep in the woods, about a 2-hour drive from the nearest town, and even that was just a dot on the map. No gas station, no grocery store, just a bar, a post office, and a couple of houses. I had to bring everything I needed with me: food, water, batteries, fuel for the generator. Don had warned me there was no cell service out there, and he wasn't lying. Once I passed the last paved road and hit the dirt trail leading to the cabin, my phone might as well have been a brick. The first few days were uneventful. The cabin was old but sturdy, one of those single-room setups with a small wood stove, a bunk, and a kitchen area. There was an outhouse a few yards away and a shed where Don kept tools, firewood, and other supplies. At night, the silence was almost suffocating. No cars, no voices, just the wind in the trees and the occasional rustle of animals moving through the underbrush. Then the noises started. At first, I told myself it was just the forest. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling, normal stuff. But then I started hearing something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, too heavy to be a deer, too steady to be random wildlife. They always came at night, just past midnight. I'd be lying in the bunk, half asleep, when I'd hear them outside, circling the cabin. I told myself it was just my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. One night, I got up the nerve to look outside. I turned off the lantern, waited for my eyes to adjust, then eased toward the window. The moon was bright, casting long shadows through the trees. First, I saw nothing. Just the clearing, the tree line, the empty porch. Then something moved. It was standing at the edge of the trees. At first glance, it looked like a man, tall and thin, but there was something off. The way it stood, too rigid, too still. I squinted, trying to get a better look, and then it took a step forward. I should have closed the curtain. I should have backed away. But I was frozen, my heart hammering against my ribs. Its limbs were too long. Its arms hung past its knees. The way it moved wasn't right. Jerky, unnatural, like it wasn't used to walking on 2 legs. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I found tracks in the dirt outside. Bare footprints. Too big for a normal person, and the toes were long, almost claw-like. They led from the tree line to the porch, then back again like something had been pacing back and forth, watching. I wanted to leave. I should have left. But I told myself I was being paranoid. I was out in the woods, alone, my mind playing tricks on me. Maybe it was just some drifter, some guy passing through. Weird, sure, but not impossible. Then I saw it again. A few nights later, I was chopping wood near the shed when I felt it. The prickling sensation of being watched. I turned slowly, scanning the trees, and there it was, closer this time. It was standing just beyond the clearing, half hidden behind a tree. I didn't move, neither did it. I could see more of it now, and the sight made my stomach twist. The skin was pale, stretched too tight over its bones. The head was wrong, too narrow, the mouth too wide. Then it did something that made my blood run cold. It smiled. Not a natural smile. Not a human smile. Too many teeth. Too sharp. The lips pulling back like it was trying to mimic an expression it didn't understand. I grabbed the axe and backed toward the cabin. It didn't move, just watched me. That grin still stretched across its face. I locked the door, shoved the table against it, and sat there with the axe in my lap until the sun came up. By morning, it was gone, but the tracks were there. More of them this time, circling the cabin, stopping just outside the door. I was done. I packed my gear, loaded up the truck, and was ready to leave when I realized something. The generator was off. I always kept it running at night. There was no reason for it to be off. But when I checked, the fuel line was cut. Not chewed, not worn down, cut, clean through like something with hands had done it. I was 60 miles from town, no way to call for help, and something was out there, watching. I didn't waste time. I got in the truck, started the engine, and peeled out of there, the tires kicking up dirt as I sped down the trail. I kept expecting to see it in the rearview mirror, running after me, that awful grin on its face. But I didn't. I didn't stop driving until I hit the main road. I didn't stop in town. I didn't stop until I was hours away, sitting in a gas station parking lot, hands shaking on the wheel. I never went back. Don called me a few days later, angry as hell. "You just up and left?" he barked. "Didn't even tell me?" I told him I wasn't staying in that cabin another night. He went quiet for a moment. Then he sighed. "Yeah," he muttered. "Figured you might say that. That was the last time I talked to him. I don't know what I saw out there. I don't want to know. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying in bed, I swear I hear something outside my window. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. Waiting.